Thank you for joining us for our first book talk sponsored by North Carolina Central Law Library and the James E. Shepherd Library. My name is Nichelle Perry, and I'm the director of the Law Library here at North Carolina Central University. And I bring you greetings on behalf of myself and the staff at the Law Library, and then my colleague, Dr. Theodosia Shields, director of the James E. Shepherd Law Library, and her staff. Dr. Shields will share closing remarks with you at the conclusion of the program. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping Zoom rules that we're all used to. So first and foremost, this session is being recorded. You all are on mute. Please make sure that you remain on mute so that we can hear the speakers without interruption. We would love to see you. So if you feel comfortable, please turn those cameras on. It helps us engage with one another and get a vibe from one another and get a feeling and get reactions. If you don't feel like using your camera, feel free to use virtual reactions to let the speakers know that you're engaged. We will reserve time for questions and comments. Please feel free to use the chat function for your questions, and we will pose them to the speakers accordingly, some dispersed throughout or perhaps the end. Okay, so now let's turn to our speakers. First, I'm going to introduce Professor Irving Joyner. Professor Joyner has been at North Carolina Central School of Law since 1982. He regularly teaches courses such as criminal law, criminal procedure, civil rights, race and law, professional responsibility, and trial practice. He has written 4 editions of criminal procedure in North Carolina, and he is, whoops, this moved over here. Okay. And he regularly speaks and lectures at legal education, civil rights, and political empowerment and educational advancement programs. He is a regular legal commentator for state, local, and national media. He's been on local and national television and is an amazing speaker and representative of the law school. He is also the co-host of the Legal Eagle Review on WNCU 90.7 on Sunday evenings, which is dedicated to the discussion of current and local national legal issues. So welcome, Professor Joyner. And finally, we have our author. J. Augustine is a reconciliation scholar, an ordained minister, and a professor. He is currently the senior pastor at St. Joseph AME Zion Church. I'm sorry, I'm AME Zion, AME Church in Durham. And he is a visiting professor of law at North Carolina Central University School of Law. He often speaks on topics related to race, reconciliation, diversity, and inclusion, and has received numerous national awards and recognitions for his work in civil rights and social justice. He is the author or editor of 4 books, and the current book is the topic of our discussion today. The book is called Call to Reconciliation: How the Church Can Model Justice, Diversity, and Inclusion. What a timely topic for what is going on in the world today. And we are excited to bring you Professor Augustine. He wears so many hats, I don't know what to call him each day. Professor, Pastor Augustine, to talk about this latest book. So without further ado, I'm gonna let Professor Augustine dive into the book and bring us some overview of the book and what prompted him to write this book.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I appreciate you more than words can say. By way of, and I also want to say thank you. So Dr. Shields, I appreciate the 2 of you all working together in collaboration. It's wonderful to be a part of the NCCU family. I see on the Zoom several people from another family I'm proud to be a part of, the St. Joseph community. Thank you also to my colleague, Irv, somebody I respect more than I can put into words. Thank you for taking the time to give the book a read and to obviously facilitate the discussion. By way of background, what is relevant about me with respect to the book? I am someone who I would affectionately describe as a bivocational minister. Vocation, when you look at the Latin origin of the word, it really means a calling, to have been called. The good Lord called me twice, and I answered the phone both times. The first calling was as a lawyer, as someone who was deeply engaged in civil rights and social justice. And the old saying is to find justice wherever she may attempt to hide. I'm a very proud graduate of Howard University, Tulane University Law School, and I served as a law clerk at the Louisiana Supreme Court for the first African-American woman, who was then an associate justice, who went on to serve as the court's first African-American chief justice. Wonderful experience. It propelled me for a wonderful career as a practicing attorney, doing civil rights work as a partner in a multi-state law firm, and then the phone rang again. Ultimately, the old saying is a calling to preach is also a calling to prepare. So that led me to Ohio to earn a Master of Divinity degree at United Theological Seminary, back to New Orleans in pastoral ministry, and to Durham in a hybrid program where I was going back and forth to earn a Doctor of Ministry at Duke Divinity School. In the midst of it all, in the midst of my studies, the world took a dramatic change. And I say a dramatic change because in my estimation, in the estimation of so many, America was moving past her darker days. We were moving forward with a very progressive narrative, with Barack Obama as a president. His presence alone symbolized so much in terms of hope and optimism for the future, and turning our backs to the dark days of the past. But somewhere along the lines, people started doing unprecedented things like screaming and calling the president of the United States a liar in the midst of the State of the Union address. We started to challenge the veracity of the president in terms of his birth certificate, with all sort of racial innuendos. And people started showing up at polling places wearing funny looking red hats that said, "Make America Great Again." The danger with that narrative means that we made a conscious decision with the 2016 election to move from a path of going forward and return to America's darkest days, return and unearth many demons that I thought were long gone. So the book is written in a very interdisciplinary lens. It speaks to me as a pastor, someone who has very deeply held convictions for social justice and equality and a welcome embrace for all human beings. It speaks to me as a lawyer, as somebody who has those same beliefs, and who had a successful career in law practice and attempting to advocate those beliefs on behalf of others, especially those who were pushed to the margins. The narrative of reconciliation is about bringing people together, and I'm sure we'll unpack exactly what that means in dialogue, but the narrative is about bringing people together, not about looking at our divisions, but about looking at that which unites us and recognizing is far greater than anything that could divide us. So the book, I do appreciate your comments, Nikki. I do believe it is timely. It's very timely in terms of all the discord and division we've seen in the United States, and it's an opportunity for us to come together, and how the church can be an exemplar to the secular world, but how many secular world, particularly business best practices, can be a model for the church.
All right, let me chime in and just raise some questions and points of interest that I hope our audience can resonate with. This is a book which seeks to put into some perspective the role of the church in dealing with civil rights, with the struggle of African Americans, and the call for reconciliation. And so at the outset, I want to kind of, because I noticed that you pay a lot of attention to the what we call the Pauline Gospel in addressing this notion of reconciliation and the biblical imperative of reconciliation. But can you kind of explain to us exactly what is it that you mean by the church? Since there are so many different branches, trees, limbs associated with that, then what is this animal that you refer to as the church?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. The church, when you unpack and go back to its Greek origins, the term the ecclesia or ecclesia, some people share, is not a brick and mortar structure. It's not a physical building. It is really an assembly. It's a body of people that come together. When you trace the origins of the word church as used in the biblical canon or in the Holy Bible, it comes into play at a very interesting time. It's introduced for the first time in the Gospel according to Matthew as Jesus is making a pilgrimage, his annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But he uses it in Matthew 16 in a place called Caesarea Philippi, which is a very, very, very Gentile area, an area heavily populated by Gentiles or non-Jews, the quote unquote proverbial other. The church, as he says to Peter, the scripture is Peter's confession. You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The reference is to a people coming together. The church later manifests, of course, in the Acts 2 narrative on the day of Pentecost, when people come together as that same Peter preaches the gospel. When you fast forward, that assembly of people I'm making reference to, careful to distinguish it from a brick and mortar structure, but when you fast forward and looking at the 20th century in the United States, there was a great division among people. There has been a division, obviously, black and white, the black church, the white church, and the various constructs, the social constructs that are human made. But when you really think about the reconciliation language that I use in the book, there's a sharp division between the progressive church, meaning the church that's interested in prophetic justice, the church that, to your point, in looking at the Pauline gospel, particularly, for example, gospels written by Paul, letters written by Paul, I should say, Galatians 3, 26 through 28 area, no longer Jew or Greek, no longer free or slave, male or female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. That is a church that's welcoming, a church that's embracing of all, embracing of the proverbial other. So there is a very liberating church that stereotypically is associated with the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, obviously, who want an embrace for everyone in society. The opposite, however, came to pass in the wake of the civil rights movement, where you saw a much less emancipatory church, as Richard Nixon made some very deliberate attempts to court evangelical voters. The Southern strategy to cause lines of division, black and white, between those who would find discomfort in the progress made of the civil rights movement and wanting to go back to a less emancipatory time. So when you fast forward, the seeds that Nixon planted really came to fruition with the 1980 presidential election, and Ronald Reagan's famous quote to evangelicals: "You can't endorse me, but I can sure endorse you." That gave solid camps, that created solid camps of division that we have seen with the progressive, emancipatory body of Christianity. I consider myself to be a part of that, ministers who seek prophetic justice, and the opposite side of the coin, much less emancipatory, those who are more interested in darker days. And the courtship there was wedded along the lines of Roe v. Wade. That much more conservative bloc, is obviously, you fast forward through time, is what gave us the Make America Great Again narrative and supported the presidency of someone who, in my humble estimation, and I think in the estimation of millions and millions of voters, should never have served in the White House.
Going back to the theological underpinnings of this, your notion of the church and the call for reconciliation, you draw distinctions between Matthew, between Peter, both of whom were disciples, and a part of the Jewish community, the Hebrew community that existed at that time, and then of Paul, who was basically the architect that created the effort to bring Jesus's word to the Gentiles and to travel abroad with it. Yet there in the Bible was never a reconciliation between the Paul effort toward spreading the gospel and the Hebrew notion, where they were basically still kind of encamped within the geographical confines of the Hebrew nation at that time. Is it really accurate to pin a call for reconciliation between those two different components of the church as it exists, or religion as it existed at that time?
Sure. So there is a a foundational scripture that I want to unpack, and I just briefly will share the three aspects of reconciliation, the three contexts in which I use the term: salvific reconciliation, social reconciliation, and then civil reconciliation. And I think the question you're posing goes to social reconciliation. So salvific reconciliation, if you think about the imagery of the Christian cross, the two planes, it says that humanity is reconciled in its relationship with God through Jesus, right? So through Jesus's sacrificial suffering, humans are reconciled in their relationship with God. But Jesus also lived. So because of Jesus, there is this theology of equality that I made reference to with Paul. We are reconciled to one another as equals to one another because of Jesus. The third is civil reconciliation, where if all means all, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, then of course prophetic justice means ministers are the logical leaders, or were the logical leaders of the civil rights movement, because they wanted to see in practice what was in principle. But there is a foundational scripture that I want to highlight that I think speaks to your question. Peter has in Acts 10, the Acts 10 narrative, Peter has a divinely inspired social encounter that I relate to our secular term, affirmative action. Peter is on a rooftop, and Peter falls asleep and has a dream to get up and kill and eat. And the dream pictures pork. Get up and kill a pig, get up and kill the swine. So Peter comes to, and Peter says, God, not me. I'm a devout Jew. Did you forget? I am a devout Jew. I can't eat that stuff. It's unclean. So God, of course, pushes back and says, how can you call unclean that which I have made clean? Peter then comes forward and says, Acts 10:34, I now realize God shows no partiality among people. The King James Version says God is no respecter of people. He does not show distinctions between the two. And Peter then baptizes Cornelius as the first Gentile he welcomes into the church. That is very powerful. That's a really, really powerful story, because God places a Jew and a Gentile in community with one another as they learn from one another. To me, that is very much like in civil reconciliation, the concept of affirmative action. It puts people of various backgrounds, various ethnicities, various socioeconomic status, puts them in community with one another to learn from one another also. And when you have a diverse learning space, a diverse environment for people, particularly obviously in the context of higher education, you really learn, just like Peter said, God is no respecter of people, because we all are the same, and we really all are equal before God.
Well, jumping forward a little bit, probably by a few thousand years, to the era of enslavement here in this country. Well, not only in this country, but in European countries as well as the Caribbean. There is this historical point that widely used by all factors in the enslavement period was the religion as the justification for enslavement. And clearly that was a part of the church, and clearly that community was not seeking reconciliation with those who they sought to enslave. How do you square this notion of the call for reconciliation with the enslavement of people, and then the use of the Bible or the religion or the church to justify that enslavement?
We certainly have seen that. Such an excellent comment and question. There is number one, many slaveholders and those who obviously owned African Americans as chattel property in enslaving states used the justification from the First Amendment of religious liberty. This is a part of my faith practice to hold these slaves, right? Which is certainly abhorrent. But as a biblical justification, oftentimes the so-called curse of Ham, the Genesis 9 narrative, that Ham and Ham's descendants were cursed, those who occupied the Canaan land, the promised land, that the Israelites went into. Those were the darker skinned people. So supposedly from the very inception of the Bible, there was a curse placed against blacks or darker skinned people. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is fabricated, made up rather, and it's not theologically based. It's something that was created wholly by humans. But we have used in a very non-progressive sense, a very non-egalitarian context. We've attempted to use religion to subvert democracy. The biggest correlation I can see now, to me, a free person and someone who has the rights of full citizenship has the right to vote, and they have the right to have and expect that their votes will be counted. What we have seen now, and I'm drawing a direct connection with the Bible, so to speak, what we have seen now is another attempt to perverse religion under Christian nationalism, which I think is the biggest threat to our democracy that you can imagine. It's a philosophy that literally and figuratively wraps the cross in the American flag and says that we are as an American people under very much a manifest destiny sort of framework. We are just like the God's chosen people. We're just like the children of Israel, and God's hand is on this country. And if you are not part of the original narrative, if you're not a white Anglo-Saxon man, if you're an African American, if you're an immigrant, then you don't belong here. And what we saw on January 6, 2021 is probably the biggest example of Christian nationalism that we have seen in recent times. But to your point, people use religion in the most perverse context to thwart democracy, to subject people to standards that should not be. So you're absolutely right in your thinking.
Well, you know, as a part of this enslavement teaching or enslavement justification, also presented the opportunity for the introduction of this brand of Christianity to the enslaved population, and as a way of controlling those who were enslaved, and supporting the notion that those individuals who would always be inferior, not only in the sight of man, but also in the sight of God, yet utilizing that framework that was set up during the enslavement period, those Africans who were enslaved began to use that structure as it existed as a way of fighting back against that those religious tenets that were present, and really kind of undergirded violent insurrections that occurred during the enslavement period. So
scholars like
Albert, have this conflict between the two versions of the church.
Absolutely so. And to your point, scholars like Albert Roberto called the church the invisible institution. It gave us, and I'm particularly proud of this as someone who is ordained and someone who serves in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, because the liberation theologies that caused the Church of Richard Allen to break away in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania back in 1787 are the same liberation theologies that undergirded folks like Denmark Vesey down in Charleston, South Carolina, with the slave insurrection, and which ended up in the burning, regrettably, of Mother Emanuel. We call it Mother affectionately, but Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. There were two firmly divided camps, to your point. If we look at Paul's, and I want to call it Paul's gospel because it really is good news, but we look at Paul's epistles, to the point we made earlier, Paul writes from a very egalitarian perspective. If all means all means all. And Paul writes about full equality and humanity among people. And there are several contexts of that I unpack in the, I think in the second or in the third chapter of the book. Religion has been used in a very perverse manner by others to subjugate, to say that women are less than, to say that African Americans are less than, to say that immigrants are less than. That's simply not the case. The religion that I practice, the Jesus that I serve, is a liberator, a conqueror, someone who loves all people because we truly are all equal in the sight of God. That those fundamental principles at face value, although they sound, and they are, secular and God talk and church talk, they really have had such a profound influence on American history. It is hard to separate them from the narrative that is America.
Yeah. And then as you suggest with Richard Allen, as in the creation of the Mother Church in Philadelphia, that then was the late 1700s.
1787 was the breakaway. Yes,
that created probably the free Christian church in the United States, but obviously in free territory rather than in enslaved territory. They then also took up the banner of demonizing the white Christian nationalist theory at the time that undergirded the notion of inferiority. How does that carry on and influence where not the civil rights movement, but the abolitionist movement is moving at that time? And is that not another example of not pushing for a reconciliation within the church?
The reconciliation language that I like to look at today, I'm going to go from a contemporary lens and then go backwards. The reconciliation language I like to look at today is more than simply religious. It's also socio-political. It deals with marginalized groups and people who have been pushed to the social periphery for a variety of reasons, because of immigrant status, because of minority status, because of ethnic status, as the case may be. And it recognizes that all people are created equal, and all people should have an opportunity to pursue the quote unquote American dream. When you think about the divisions and the castigation of certain groups, and I name those, it's not new. It's something that is old as time, but it's something that goes back through American history, obviously through enslavement. I am so very encouraged by the role the church played in spite of enslavement, but the role the church played in working with abolitionists, people like Frederick Douglass, someone who deeply was engaged with the social activists of the church at his time. Believe it or not, Frederick Douglass worked very closely with quote unquote evangelical Christians. We have done a complete 180 in terms of what it is to be an evangelical Christian in the United States. I would lift up Jimmy Carter as an example of someone who was an evangelical Christian and someone who cared deeply about equality and service to others. And just to highlight in the context of the law school, one of our most famous graduates, NCCU's law school's famous graduates, is Brother Mickey Mishaw, who was the first African-American to serve as a United States attorney in the state of North Carolina. He was a Jimmy Carter appointee. Nonetheless, though, we have done a complete 180 with what evangelical Christians, or the social perception of what evangelical Christians are, because of deliberate attempts to be perverse with what religion is and its influence in the public domain.
Well, I guess, and then moving us on further, because the schism within the practice of the church during the enslavement period kind of continued even through Reconstruction. You had, on the one hand, within the African-American church, which is certainly different than with the white evangelical church, there was a liberation motif that guided that ministry. And obviously during Reconstruction, the AME, the AMEZ, the CME, all began to spread out from free territory into formerly enslaved community. But then there was developing within the South probably another kind of African-American church born out of the enslavement period that basically became the Baptist church and then the Pentecostal church, much of which shied away from this progressive notion that was being advanced by the AME, AMEZ, and the CME. Can you kind of talk about that schism and how or if those two collectives ever merged together with respect to their thoughts about the impact of Christianity on the liberation of African Americans?
Sure, and let me go back. You have really got my juices flowing, and I'm excited because there's on the continuum of American history, when we look back at the Reconstruction period, you're absolutely right, and at the more emancipatory church, if you will, that division of the church, which I'm proud to say as an AME minister, was led by AME pastors. So in Mississippi, the first African American elected to the United States Senate was an AME pastor, Hiram Rhodes Revels. Was pastor of Mount Zion AME Church in Mississippi. Henry McNeil Turner in our denomination in AME Church is called one of the four horsemen, really one of the pillars of the church, was elected a bishop in the church, but was an African-American state representative in Georgia and was way ahead of himself, way ahead of his time in terms of his thoughts on liberation and et cetera, for freedom, for full equality for African-Americans. That time period of Reconstruction was very special in terms of the empowerment of African Americans, but the pendulum swung because in 1877, obviously, when the troops were withdrawn from the South, violence ensued. And again, religion became a dominant factor in quote unquote justifying that violence under what was often called the religion of a lost cause, the religion of a lost cause, excuse me. People who romanticized the South, sort of symbolically, I almost say this in jest, but symbolically represented by the old quote from Gone with the Wind, and the South shall rise again, right? So folks who romanticized the institution of slavery, and it wasn't that bad. This was God ordained. So if this was God ordained, those who would fight against it, they're against God. And then we see seeds of Christian nationalism. And when you fast forward to 2021 and you see T-shirts or flags that say Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, that is a conflation of church and state that's very, very dangerous for democracy. But in terms of a reconnection or a reconciliation, if you will, and following through history, we have been firmly on two camps. So the church, again, that ecclesia, that body has been divided between much less emancipatory practices and those who are much more liberative in their practices. I am encouraged now. I will say this. I am encouraged. I'm perpetually Pollyanna. I am encouraged because I feel like the bottom fell out as a result of 2020 and the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Because if it can't get any worse, it can only get better. And I have seen deliberate attempts, deliberate organizational efforts, I should say, by faith communities that have traditionally, as in the last 40 to 50 years, been much more conservative, into piety and not into politics, reaching out and looking for reconciliation. These are some of the things I speak to in the latter part of the book, and these are some of the things I actually am seeing, so it's very encouraging. People who recognize that we really are all God's children, Black, white, Jew, Gentile, to quote Dr. King, or to paraphrase Dr. King, but to go back to the scripture, God is no respecter of persons. We all are made in the image of God. So regardless of the social constructs of a thing called race that we have defined as humans, we are all equal in the sight of God, and we should all be treated as equals before the law. So I am very encouraged by faith groups, again, that have traditionally been on the side of being much less emancipatory and regressive, I think, in terms of their practices, reaching out and being very deliberate and wanting to come more to the center now. So I'm very encouraged about what the future will hold.
Okay, and our time is running out, so I'm just going to jump us up just a little bit, and then I'm going to turn this back to Nikki, who's the AMEZ in the gathering before us. But you know, in the late 1960s, 1970s, James Cone at Union Theological Seminary developed this notion of Black liberation theology, which created a different path within the progressive movement within the church. Prior to that time, there had been a lot of conflict that existed with Martin Luther King and some of the National Baptist Association members with a lot of conflict. But as we move forward with this so-called progressive theology among African Americans, and this notion of reconciliation, can that be achieved where there is only one side seeking the reconciliation?
It is two sides. The classic paradigm says that the reconciliation narrative has two sides of a coin. Of course, there is forgiveness, but there's got to be a reciprocal change in behavior. Very briefly, I lift up, because he's someone I never had the pleasure of meeting, but I certainly have read several of his works, including Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness. Desmond Tutu speaks emphatically about the importance of forgiveness in the reconciliation paradigm. And he lifts up Nelson Mandela as an example, the first democratically elected head of state in South Africa after confinement for God knows how much time, but after confinement, before his inauguration, he literally invites his jailer, the person who jailed him for years and years, to a seat of honor at his inauguration, not to taunt, not to poke at, but because he knew the importance of forgiveness for his own sake, but the importance of forgiveness in moving forward. As a Christian minister, I would also hold up as an exemplar of forgiveness Jesus the Christ, the thing we celebrate on the 7 Last Sayings on Good Friday. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So on one side of the reconciliation coin, forgiveness is also important. On the opposite side of the coin, however, there's got to be a change in behavior. And the paradigm presupposes, of course, there is a dominant class and there's a subjective class, right? So the class that has been doing, or that has been subjected, must engage in forgiveness, but the class that has been doing the subjecting should have a deliberate change in behavior. You can't continue to have a liquid come in my face and tell me it's raining, right? You can't, that's the old saying, you can't continue to do those things and tell me it's raining. There's got to be a deliberate change in behavior, notwithstanding the fact that certain social systems have inured to your benefit for hundreds of years. So if there is, and both of those are hard work, both of those are very, very hard work. So if there is the reciprocal willingness to move forward, we truly can move forward toward reconciliation. But again, it takes hard work on both sides.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Nelson Mandela. I was going to come to that and his notion of pushing forward in South Africa to bring a new political reality to that country. Yet Mandela was not a disciple of the church.
Right, correct.
Was not an activist within within the church. Transferring that into the American context in terms of where we are now, as we move through this history, that white nationalist church is still the same white nationalist church. It is undergirded by the MAGA symbol, where it shows no signs of breaking away from that old theology that was developed as far back as during the enslavement period. So when we talk about reconciliation at this point, are we not stuck in a position that we're trying to reconcile with ourselves rather than with those who would deem to put us back under the shackles?
So you're always going to have extremes, and there are extremes on both sides of the political or social equation, right? What I am seeing as a minister and someone who is engaged actively in ministry in the community, I am seeing a move much more so to the center now. Of course, you will have those extremes. You have people who are going to believe in inequality among people rather than equality among people. Those people are going to exist and continue to exist, right? But what I am seeing by and large by some of the more popular conservative groups now, Southern Baptists, again, traditionally evangelical groups, white evangelical groups, is a recognition that 2020 really was a year of reckoning, and recognizing that the political alliances, again, I go back to the Southern strategy, the seeds that were sown there in the 1968 presidential campaign, those seeds that started to grow and sprout with the 1980 presidential campaign, and the seeds that gave us the horror of Make America Great Again. They recognize that that tree has got to be pruned up, that tree has got to go. So I'm seeing more conservative groups move back to the center. I'm encouraged by that, because that is not a willingness to stand and trump your chest and try to defend the positions. It's a recognition that perhaps we have gone astray and we need to move back toward the center. That language, I would respectively call a willingness to meet people, a willingness to do some things differently. That is arguably one side of the reconciliation coin. The question then becomes, if on the opposite side of the reconciliation coin, we're willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and try to come forward and move together as one country and one people.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shields, Professor Perry. Thank you so very much for putting this together. Thank you, Reverend Augustine, for this really outstanding treatise here that you have presented. I would propose that this is not enough time to really get into this topic, and what we need is a weekend of communion so that we can sit down and have some in-depth discussion about the many points that you have raised in the book that you presented. So I commend reading of it to everyone, and I'll turn it over now to Dr. Shields and Professor Perry to lead us from this point.
All right, and thank you all so much. Thank all of you so much, and Irv, thank you so much for obviously the depth and the analysis you have taken us through. Thank you more than words can say.
I know. Dr. Shields, before you come before us, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. First and foremost, thank you, Professor Joyner, for really leading us through some very complex and terminology and complex history that I believe Professor Augustine really did a great job of leading us through and talking about how he addresses that in his text. So we have two questions in the chat, and I believe they're very similar. The first is from Amber Kraft. How do we have reconciliation apart from America first acknowledging their wrongs and the role that the church plays, and what would acknowledgement look like? And then from Dean Lee, the same line of questioning, how does this manifest toward post 1/6/20? Is this 21, Dean Shields?
Yes, I'm sorry, 21.
Okay. Yeah. How does this movement toward post 1/6/21 manifest itself other than by words? So again, are we getting the same lip service that people are accustomed to getting?
So one thing, thank you. Two excellent questions, and I'll do my best in the interest of time to sort of roll them together. 2020, I think, was a real year of reckoning, and in the true sense of that word, it was a settling of accounts, and that America had to look herself in the mirror and figure out where she went wrong. If you just take a glimpse and look at pictures of protesters, of those who believed in prophetic justice and those who followed their First Amendment right to take it to the streets in the context of what I call civil reconciliation in the book, if you look at those and the demographics of the 1960s, the demographics, certainly there were white, certainly there were non-Christian, certainly there were the proverbial others involved, but the majority of protesters were African Americans because this was an African American issue. In 2020, as a result of, and I should lift up, tomorrow is the anniversary of Ahmaud Arbery's death. In the wake of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and obviously George Floyd, America became woke. And in the midst of the pandemic, before people were vaccinated, you had multi-ethnic crowds, multi-generational crowds, people that came together recognizing inherent bigotries that had been perpetuated against African Americans, and people came together taking it to the street for justice. A much more secular crowd, not just the segregation of the church, but a much more secular crowd, multi-ethnic crowd that took it to the street for justice. I share those things to say I am deeply encouraged by the progress we're making. One of the things I like to lift up is the analogy of gumbo. I'm a native of New Orleans. I like to talk about the shrimp being shrimp, about the okra being okra, about the hen being hen, and being able to see them individually, but recognizing they come together in community. That's where we are as a country now. We really are moving together toward community. And for me, this is much different than the quote unquote melting pot of yesteryear, because that denotes some sort of assimilation. Now we want you to be your full and authentic self in America, and I'm encouraged by the progress we're making.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shields now.
Good afternoon. Thank you so very much. First of all, Nikki, for allowing Shepherd Library to be a part of this very wonderful, informative discussion. Professor Augustine, thank you so very much for such a wonderful book, and the call. The conversation today, Professor Joyner, this has been so enlightening. It was an education for all of us. And I challenge you to continue sharing this and bringing this to the attention of all of us. Thank you so very much, audience, for your time. We hope everyone enjoyed this wonderful learning experience. Thank you again and have a good evening.
Thank you so much as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.